Welcome everyone to the Co-Creators Convergence Thursday night Creator Convos. We have a wonderful conversationalist tonight, and Bob is going to be hosting tonight for a wonderful change. And he's going to introduce you to Tahil Sharma, who we met through United Religions Initiative. And we've heard him speak. He's very dynamic. Bob's going to tell you a lot more about him and what his talk is, and there will be time for a discussion. So before I turn the baton, the talking stick, whatever you want to call it, over to Bob, my beloved, I am going to share a little bit about the Co-Creators Convergence and what we have coming up in April. The April newsletter just went out today. So hold on and let me get that for you. So welcome everyone to the Co-Creators Convergence. It's a wonderful gathering tonight. I'm very excited about our guests. And without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, my beloved Bob.
Thanks, Noelle. This is going to be a very exciting evening. Every Thursday night, we're here. Amazing people bringing their gift to the shift in humanity. And this evening, we'll hear from Tahil about Audacity to Courage, an interfaith case for social justice, something that many of us are very, very interested in, and all of us are affected by. So I am just absolutely thrilled, and looking at that video about what we have coming up in the next month, wow, that's all I can say. In fact, anyone who has suggestions of other conversationalists that would be a part of this circle on a Thursday night, please let us know. We're already completely filled up for May, and now taking spaces for in June. So I have the delight this evening to be chatting with Tahil Sharma, who has been promoting interfaith cooperation through the social justice lens for over a decade now. Most recently, he has been the regional coordinator for North America of the Interfaith, of the United Religions Initiative, we refer to as URI. United Religions Initiative. He was born to a Hindu father and a Sikh mother, and was inspired to do the work of literacy, engagement, and equity following the shooting of the Sikh Temple there in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, back in 2012 by a white supremacist. Noelle and I were blessed to really get to know the work of URI generally in January and February of 2020. During the UN's Interfaith Harmony Week, we were a part of a delegation of 100 people that were traveling to the Middle East, to Jordan, Palestine, and Israel, hosted by the Eco Peace Middle East organization. And there were about 100 peacemakers, artists, musicians, interfaith folks from the Vatican, and Tibetan monks, and indigenous folks from the United States and from Australia. And there we learned much more about URI's work globally. And when we returned, COVID became a thing that caused a shift in so many people's lives. The shift in our life included us coming to Northeast Tennessee, where, by coincidence, there is a URI local cooperation circle. And we've been active in that ever since. Tahil has been very helpful to us as a coach to our local group, so we really appreciate that. So this evening, a presentation and then conversation with all of us, which I'm really looking forward to both, titled Audacity to Courage, an Interfaith Case for Social Justice. So the interfaith movement in North America has been around for 130 years. Formally, I'm sure it existed on a more local basis even before that. But it's rooted in the first Parliament of the World's Religions, which took place at the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893. The next one is coming up in Chicago again this year in August. Since then, hundreds of communities have found their way to engage in relationship building and in the dialogue that's necessary to clear misconceptions and to strengthen the bonds between communities, between faith communities. So it is a delight to have you with us here, Tahil. Appreciate you bringing us all in the sacred circle we have this evening and all over the world with a centering. And we look forward to your presentation and then look forward to conversations. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Bob. Thank you, Noel. And good evening, everyone. I'm excited to share space with you all today, getting to talk about this kind of difficult conversation that we like to call the interfaith case for social justice. The reason why I titled it From Audacity to Courage is because we exist at a time when we see a lot of audacity on the ground when it comes to politics and society, whether we are engaging in the partisanship of trying to pass legislation to much of the realities of a post-COVID and post-truth reality, where it has become hard to be able to own our convictions while being able to share alliances and understandings with others who may think differently from us. And I want this to be a space for us to really consider where we take audacity and put it to the side for a moment as an opportunity to not assume that we will dehumanize, that we will deject, that we will put ourselves or others in harm's way in the name of trying to aim for progress. What we are aiming for is courage. We're aiming for a radical inclusion and an opportunity to be able to achieve a peace that we haven't seen in our reality before. And we're going to talk about some of the nitty-gritty of what that can look like when we really think about the core issues that exist when we think about the interfaith movement and its understood history of 130 years versus thinking about what the next 130 years might actually look like. So the discussion that I want to offer is, while I will be talking about URI as an organization, I will also be talking about a number of issues that are often uncomfortable to discuss in an interfaith context. We ask for you to engage in the discomfort because I personally believe that discomfort leads to transformation, but also give yourself the space necessary to step aside if you need to, if you feel like things may be a bit too controversial, or it may be affecting you in a very personal way that might be invoking some emotions that you're not necessarily comfortable sharing in the space. You should have the respect to step away from the space as you need to. And of course, I'm open to any and all questions. So please feel free to ask whatever you'd like towards the end of our conversation, after this presentation, of course, just so that we have the opportunity to really think and sit with the information that you might get to hear today. So first, Bob in his introduction was kind enough to talk a bit about URI, which is the United Religions Initiative. It's the world's largest network of grassroots interfaith organizations, where we have 1,117 chapters, or what we call cooperation circles, in 111 countries. So needless to say, URI is not a small network. All of these member organizations are dedicated to being a part of this commitment to our mission and values, which was established and founded by Bishop William Swing, who was the former Episcopal Bishop of the state of California. He initially had the story of thinking about a United Nations of faith and spirituality for all people to participate in. And back in the 90s, he actually reached out formally to a number of different major faith leaders who he wanted to make sure were represented in the shared space of thinking about peace, justice, and healing. And sure enough, after asking all of them if they'd be willing to send delegations to be a part of this conversation, all of them said no. With sort of a sad face, he kind of took the conversation internally and said, well, if the faith leaders aren't going to show up, then who will? And he immediately answered his own question by saying, of course. And rather than looking at the pulpits, I should have been looking at the pews. So he decided to turn to the communities themselves, the members of various faith traditions, spiritual movements, indigenous cultures and traditions, and more, to be a part of this larger conversation that took years of exchange to actually come up with our charter, our mission, and our values. Which ultimately leads us to talking about the purpose of URI, which is to promote an enduring daily interfaith cooperation, to end religiously motivated violence, and to create cultures of peace, justice, and healing for the earth and all living beings. These sound like very vast, almost, vague goals to achieve. But this is kind of the power of what URI is trying to prove when we are focusing on the work of connecting with communities on the ground. This is to say that from the 1,100 communities that you will find in over 100 countries, each group is contextually working and using interfaith cooperation to achieve these major goals. And it takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of different communities and styles of thinking to be able to come up with unique solutions to various problems. And this is what we're trying to own at the United Religions Initiative. But we then tend to think about this idea of these larger, more controversial issues that come up. When we've thought about major world events like COVID-19, when we've thought about the crisis in Ukraine and its war with Russia, or when we've thought about LGBTQ inclusion with many of the anti-queer, anti-drag, and anti-trans legislation that's being passed in numerous states, we kind of get stuck in a situation about how we as an organization or we as an interfaith movement can really take a stance. And ultimately, we have to think about the best outcome that helps us live up to the reality that we will achieve peace, justice, and healing. So a lot of that is actually based deeply in, what we call our PPPs, which are the preamble, purpose, and principles that help us to commit as individuals to being a part of a larger movement for improving the world, repairing it, and making it a better place. It helps us to think about uniting in responsible cooperative action. It helps us to think about providing a space for all people to participate, even especially those who are often not heard in these spaces. We have specific principles that talk about welcoming the gift of diversity, welcoming equitable participation from women and men, and thinking about reconciliation to resolve conflict without resorting to violence. These are core, aspects of our charter, our way of understanding the principles that bring so many communities together to be a part of our network. And as grandiose as that sounds, I wish there was a honest way to be able to hold all of our communities accountable, let alone the interfaith movement, let alone society at large. But unfortunately, we have come into this predicament where standing up for these bigger issues requires a much larger conversation. It requires a more candid conversation about what it really looks like to address these issues on the ground. So at this current point, we have to consider What does that look like for the interfaith movement currently? What does it mean for all of us to really be engaged in this larger conversation of peace, justice, and healing? Are we actually committing to the work that we're speaking about? Or are we actually creating a facade, which is something that we actually really need to be concerned about? Are we actually committing ourselves to taking things above and beyond the specific ways that we function as communities of faith, spirituality, indigeneity, and moral conscience? Or are we just using that as an excuse to feel like we are doing good things when in reality we have no impact? So a lot comes to mind actually when I started thinking about this conversation some time ago as I joined the United Religions Initiative. As of a couple weeks ago, I completed 3 years at the organization, and I started my first day on the job when the COVID-19 pandemic actually caused the state of California to shut down. That was March 16th, 2020. And that was my first day on the job at this global nonprofit as a regional coordinator for the United States and Canada. So let me say that that came with a lot of stress, that came with a lot of obstacles, but it came with an opportunity to actually begin a really important conversation about interfaith work in a very vulnerable time for many communities around the world. And through that time, through meeting with dozens of organizations, through having conversations one-on-one with faith leaders, community leaders, and everyone in between, it was very clear that there are just these concerns that many people may hold on to and may not vocalize within their communities, let alone speaking to those who are leaders within the movement. And these were very real concerns that I have brought up in many situations, but somehow people just were not able to really think about it in depth. So does what we say or what we do live into the radical inclusion of the interfaith movement? This idea of inclusion is one that can be really challenging when we think about interfaith cooperation. Oftentimes, we like to look at this idea of radical inclusion as being able to bring people together across the spectrum of religion and spirituality. And unfortunately, it kind of gets left up to interpretation based on the different groups that you might talk to. The fact of the matter is that many interfaith groups, historically speaking, even going back to the Parliament of the World's Religions, did actually start off as spaces for ecumenical work before they became spaces for interfaith work. So it was first trying to get Christians to get along with other Christians. Then it was noticing that there were folks from the Jewish community. They were added into the list. Then it was noting that there were Muslims, adding them to the list. Then it was noting folks that were coming from the Eastern traditions like Hinduism, Sikhism, Buddhism, and Jainism, adding them to the list. And that's where slowly you see that number of diversity and inclusion really becoming a hallmark of what interfaith communities have been talking about. But unfortunately, there's still a big struggle about what that inclusion actually looks like now in 2023. There are a lot of communities that still struggle with trying to include some of the faith communities that I've mentioned by name. Some of them will even include new spiritual movements that often have controversial backgrounds or origins. And there's still a struggle of being able to include folks who are atheist, secular humanist, agnostic, or who belong to the nones, the ones who are not officially religiously affiliated with the community. So the topic of this radical inclusion is really tough. It's people don't know where to go with this conversation because they're still trying to figure out what does inclusion look like. And unfortunately, not only are we still struggling with this idea of what that inclusion looks like, but somehow we feel like in many communities that I've paid attention to, that the only form of inclusion in interfaith spaces is the inclusion of religiously and spiritually diverse people but where no other diversity exists. Diversity of ethnicity and culture and race, the diversity of sexual orientation and gender orientation, the diversity of socioeconomic status. Oftentimes, those are not identities that we think matter in an interfaith space, when in reality, it's a key part to aiming for that radical diversity that we're hoping to achieve. And we still have a very long way to go. The second question, do our words or actions invite controversy or partisanship? Oftentimes when we're talking about major issues that are impacting us at the societal level in our local communities, whether we are talking about food security, homelessness, the environment, or political accountability, many communities are concerned that if they try to take a stance, if they try to make their perspectives known as a community about how they feel about a specific issue, that they will lean into a controversy that will not allow their community to grow or get along, or that they feel like they might be entering partisanship and actually taking a stance that is merely moral more than partisan. And oftentimes that can be a challenge to deal with, because everything, unfortunately, now in the lens that we're thinking about in the American body politic is that everything is partisan, when in reality, we as the interfaith movement have a job to make sure that we address issues not because we are being political or partisan, but because we know those issues to be morally urgent. And we have to be very careful about how we take those steps as individuals, as communities, and as a movement at large, to make sure that we are holding ourselves accountable and we are holding each other accountable. Are we expected to deal with conflicts or concerns that don't apply to our communities? I've heard about this time and time again, especially when it comes to my original point about radical diversity. We often struggle with this idea that if our space is not struggling with this issue, why do we need to pay attention to this issue? And this goes back to, I think, not just the principles of our organization at URI, but this actually goes back to the reality that if we are genuinely striving for the dignity and respect and the due process and the progress of all people, that we do not have to be personally inflicted or impacted by specific issues to care about them and to show up for others in solidarity to support them. And we tend to struggle with that because a lot of these issues are very hard places to start working on. If you have no idea about the issue and you are leaning on the guidance or the expertise of other people, we often have to be careful about the due diligence that it takes to make sure that we genuinely understand an issue before we take a stance on it. And this is why we have to be careful when a lot of these issues do come up, and we as interfaith communities are asked to step in to be able to offer a perspective. And ultimately, the concern of all concerns, are we not asked to love everyone unconditionally? Unconditional love is something that we often refer to as agape. We also try to use it as much as possible in an attempt to understand that all human beings, all creatures in this world deserve love. They deserve respect. They deserve dignity. But we oftentimes confuse that unconditional love as an attempt to create oneness or sameness or uniformity. And we have to be careful that this unconditional love doesn't take us away from contextual compassion, from the nuance that helps us to actually show that unconditional love. We have to be really responsible to each other by making sure we're paying attention to why we're different, what makes us different, and how we show our responsibility by making sure that we read into context deeply enough to actually help people with where they're standing on the issues that they care about. So this is all to say that these help us lean into the deeper challenges of how we think about the effect, the impact, and the way forward with interfaith work. What's foundational to an individual's experience or identity is often sidelined by a sharp focus on peace, unity, harmony, and other grandiose concepts. So I heard this a number of times in spaces when responding to the killing of George Floyd by an officer, that many folks who were wanting to step in and support Black lives were then often bogged down by other community members who told them, no, all lives matter. We are here for peace. We are here for oneness. We are here because we are unified. But the fact of the matter is in an attempt to actually try to show that unconditional love that I mentioned just a minute ago, you have actually sidelined the name of creating space for intersectional learning and justice, where the themes that are grandiose like peace, unity, and harmony actually are just words to placate people. They're there to appease so that we do not enter the truth that there are some harsh issues that we have to address systemically and historically that no one else can address unless we talk about it in the room that we're in. And this is where spiritual bypassing comes in, where folks will use these kinds of values, these ways of understanding oneness, interconnectedness, particularly, to actually help dismiss and diminish the realities of what people, communities of color, LGBTQ people, and folks who are in the minority are genuinely experiencing. And we have to be careful as folks who are in the interfaith movement to make sure that we are actually listening. We're listening deeply, actively, intentionally, and contextually to the needs of people, to their concerns, to the challenges that they face if we're really going to make sure we uplift them and equalize them in society. If we constantly use these ideas of peace and harmony and unity to just push them aside and say, oh, but we all have issues, but we all have concerns, but we all have experiences, we're not actually honoring the sacred in them to be able to uplift them out of those difficult situations. So we have to do a better job at being able to pay attention to why they have conditions created for them and why the interfaith movement should actually be the space where they're being supported as much as possible. Although the commitment to our principles, our preamble, and our charter at large at URI is required to participate in these spaces, whether you're in an individual community or the larger URI network, this actually doesn't guarantee that all people participate with the intent of uplifting, dignifying marginalized people. We work in a reality where all of the organizations that join us as members are still autonomous organizations. They're going to do the work that they feel makes sense for them in the communities that they are out connected with. And what ends up happening is we cannot really do the due diligence of making sure that they're all doing the job of honoring the PPPs in exactly those ways. And so what we come to find out is that, unfortunately, we do have deep rifts within a space like URI. We do have deep disagreements about how we see certain issues, whether we talk about issues like the Holy Land and Israel and Palestine, whether we are talking about issues of Kashmir in South Asia, whether we are talking about the LGBTQ community at large and its ability to be able to thrive equally in a heteronormative society. Not everyone agrees that they deserve to be uplifted and that they deserve dignity. And that's a weird way for us to be able to, cop out as a larger organization and not really support people for where they're at. And it's something that I've been trying to address as an individual, along with my colleagues and along with other communities who are trying to hold our feet to the fire to say, do we actually mean what we say when we say we want to fight for peace, justice, and healing for all people, when we know that many exceptions exist against the rule that people want to be uplifted, especially when they're marginalized. So it's a part of a very, very difficult conversation that we need to have going forward in thinking about why this work matters and who the work is impacting. Are we actually doing the work that is reaching out to those who are least benefited from the systems that we have set up currently? And more importantly, are we honoring them because their marginalization sets a precedent for how, unfortunately, interfaith communities even continue this idea of marginalizing and oppressing and ostracizing? And this is where we have to deal with some of the major systemic realities of what we're up against. What's challenging us and making our spaces actually exclusive without realizing it, or helping us to thrive in a theology or a culture of comfort with the peace and the harmony that we talk about so profusely. One of the big ones that stands out in the experience that I've had doing interfaith work is white supremacy. Unfortunately, there are many spaces that center white supremacy in the name of interfaith cooperation, not purposefully, but because they have taken the systemic, cultural, legal, and other norms that make these spaces function hierarchically, that make them function without being able to listen to the needs of those who are most marginalized, and unfortunately, who allow us to be able to really see that in a real world, interfaith communities sometimes can behave like bubbles that don't want to actually live into the reality that the world is very unjust for many people, and that we have to acknowledge that there's an active role that we need to play in undoing much of the injustice that has already been done in the name of faith, in the name of human rights, in the name of democracy, and everything else. And white supremacy does have to play a role with that, whether we like it or not. The second is religious nationalism. We are seeing that translated into many ways because many faith traditions are developing nationalist and supremacist movements that are doing their work to undo democracy, to undo human rights, to take away protections from those who are most marginalized. And they do so in ways that are very conspicuous, but that are also very audacious. We are seeing people undo democracy through democracy in the name of religion nationalism here in the United States, as an example, through many bills that are being passed at the local and state levels to really ostracize communities even further than they already are at. We're dealing with the realities that marginalized communities are sometimes becoming accomplices to these systems and cultures because they don't understand the nature of a genuine liberation of mutual abundance that we all deserve as a part of being, in the human experience, as a part of being the shared fabric of, let's say in this case, being in the United States, in a what is supposed to be a unified country defending due process and the rights of all people, but not actually honoring that in every sense of the word. And I know that there's a lot that I'm saying right now. There's a lot to process right now. So there will be room at the end to be able to really flush this out and really talk about things more deeply. So I apologize for my pacing. I know it is a lot. But this is because the interfaith movement is destined and postured to be able to be the most inclusive movement in human history. And I don't feel we're really living up to it. And one of the biggest ways that I've seen that happen has been through the privilege that has existed within interfaith spaces in North America. I've listed about 8 or 9 different characteristics that typically define who's in the room when we're talking about interfaith work. Many of the members, many of the leaders, many of the fundraisers who make interfaith communities possible are very typically white, cisgendered, heteronormative, patriarchal, upper class or wealthy, above the age of 50, Christian or particularly spiritual, English-centered, and from the global north, meaning those from the northern hemisphere. And this is not to say that we are taking these specific characteristics, these specific character traits, and saying that we cannot allow people who are a part of these things to be a part of the interfaith movement. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is what you typically find in many interfaith spaces is that these classifications in particular actually define the experiences of many people in the room who are doing this work. And what that does is when other folks who are trying to look for diversity and inclusion and are trying to turn to the interfaith movement, but they usually see it being defined or seeing a majority of people coming from these specific categories in one space, you tend to create doubt. You tend to create distrust. You tend to create a lack of confidence that allows you to feel that the ideals that you're living up to are not being lived out or even represented in the spaces you're going into. And I took these classifications not only from conversations from people, but from the dozens, if not hundreds of organizations that I engage with in the United States and Canada, where a significant majority of each of these groups actually has most of these categories checked off. And when I ask where all the diverse people are, I don't really get an honest answer, but even they don't know where they are. And one of the places that I struggle with the most, actually, as someone who is under the age of 35, is trying to find out where young people are. I'm always asked this question when I enter the space of doing interfaith work. Tahil, you're someone that's under 40. You tell us where the young people are. Why are they not coming to us? And I often smirk and laugh to myself because it's kind of a hard pill to swallow for many folks. But unfortunately, interfaith spaces do not offer any sort of value add to the life of a young person. And if your community does not help young people figure out what the value add is of interfaith work, of interfaith leadership and cooperation, a young person will not come into this space to engage. Neither will communities of color, neither will people who are impoverished, neither will people who do not speak English as a first language or who speak English well at all. So we have to be very clear that we are trying to create spaces that are transformative, that are inclusive, and that are ultimately trying to make a larger social positive impact going forward. But people have to know the value and the power of this work and where they can see themselves doing that work, because it's the most important thing they can do. And it's going to take a long way for us to be able to do this work, succinctly, successfully, and sustainably. Because it's a long way to go. Unfortunately, with talking about the Parliament of the World's Religions, which is coming up in a couple of months, sometimes I like to think that a lot of people still think they're doing interfaith work like it is the first Parliament of the World's Religions in 1893. And I'm asking people to catch up, not just to the 21st century, but to think about who you're missing from this image of the parliament that needs to be there so that this movement can sustain itself going forward. So the larger question that we have to ask at the end of the day, which is going to impact all of us, is what does the future hold for the interfaith movement? What is our way forward? How do we think about it? What does it look like? And I think one person that really summed it up well for me is someone that many of us know because we have seen his work alongside Nelson Mandela during the anti-apartheid movement. We saw him as a very important faith leader in conversations about interfaith work, but about showing up to basically every issue with the same fervor as he did in trying to dismantle apartheid, which is Archbishop Desmond Tutu. This quote always stands with me. I oppose such injustice against LGBTQ plus people with the same passion that I opposed apartheid. Archbishop Tutu mentioned this back in 2013 as a part of the UN Free and Equal campaign to help uplift and equalize LGBTQ people. And as someone who was dedicated to fighting apartheid with every tooth and nail that he had, from helping to chair the Truth and Reconciliation forums, to helping, free South Africa of the oppression that it had created because of colonialism, he took that same energy and put it into fighting for the rights of those in the Holy Land who are suffering oppression. He took it to the fight against communities who are oppressing LGBTQ people. He took it into spaces to fight for environmental justice and for environmental sustainability. The issue did not affect him directly in some ways, but somehow he still showed up for other issues that mattered with the same energy of trying to fight against apartheid. And that is the invitation that I'm extending to everyone in this room today. The issues don't have to affect you for you to show up and show solidarity. The communities that are affected may be communities you don't know about, but you still have a responsibility to show up and listen and learn and grow. To hold ourselves accountable, our spaces need to reflect the same values that we preach about and make sure they come into practice. And that's all to say that this is the biggest opportunity for us to see the interfaith movement go where it's never been before, which is to actually achieve cultures of peace, justice, and healing. So with that, I kind of want to wrap up this time together to share some gratitude with you all for letting me really stand on my soapbox to share a lot of grievances, but to also remind us that we are the ones that have the power to change things. Here are my details to be able to be in contact with me through email and through social media. But most importantly, I want to invite all of you to really think deeply about the ways that you may have unfortunately affirmed some of the norms of interfaith work and how you might want to consider changing that going forward. This change in the interfaith movement is mine and yours to really be in control of. But most importantly, it's a part of the larger conversation that we have to really make this world a better place. And I don't want to be burdened with being the only person that does it. We all have a role to play in it because the monsters of things like religious nationalism and white supremacy cannot be fixed by one person. It cannot be fixed by one piece of legislation, and it can't be fixed by one overnight change of thought about how the world functions. It takes all of us to create the problems, and it takes all of us to fix the problems. So thank you so much for your time. And I'd like to turn it back to Bob and Noel as we enter more of a community space to be in conversation with one another.
Wow, that's a lot of audacity, and that's a lot of courage. Thank you so much, Tahil. Wow. So much, like you said, you were moving fast through it, but there I was taking notes. I'm sure others are taking mental notes of to have conversation and questions for you about all of this. It is it's just an amazing time that we live in, and Jean Houston, I love Jean Houston saying this is the most interesting times ever, or however she says it exactly. And I've heard her say it for 20 years. And so apparently it's rolling forward into the present moment for every one of us. And it's really look forward to coming back to have some of that conversation at tail end there about inclusivity of young people in the conversation and your term value add. But for the moment, I'd rather first start with inviting anyone and everyone that would like to put on your turn on your video. Please do so, and then comments, questions, concerns, thoughts, ideas for Tahil would be fantastic. Let's make this a conversation circle. And if you would use your reaction button at the bottom tray, put up your hand if you would. And Christy is already ready to. And that would be wonderful. Look forward to the conversations. Christy, go ahead and unmute yourself if you can.
Yes, I think I am.
Good to have you.
Anyway, Tahil, thank you so much. What a powerful and deep dive. That was not easy to articulate, I imagine anyway. All of the incredible nuances of what it really takes to be inclusive. And I'm a longtime social justice advocate. I had the good fortune in being raised in Hawaii, where you couldn't go anywhere, whether you went to the rich area, the poor area, where there wasn't multicultural expression and people, and there was no such thing as an all-white area. I didn't even know such a thing existed until I came to the United States for college. And suddenly I was driving and I came across this section, and all of a sudden I noticed, wow, there's no white people anywhere. It was so apparently different, and I'd never experienced that. But it's been a lifelong passion. And one of the things that I'm grateful to Bob and Noel for inviting you on and bringing you on, because that's the way I do it in all my events and sacred ceremonies and celebrations I do. I just don't do them without inclusion. So I figure out what's not included, who's not included, and then I invite that person to come and be a part of it. But I still have mysteries in terms of how to be the value add that you spoke of for young people. And I actually, if you go and look at the archive of my talk with Bob and Noel, it's partly because as children we were raised with all the Disney movies that told us to be afraid of older people, especially older women. We were young people, especially young women, were not to go near the elder woman because she was a witch, or she was going to turn into a dragon and eat your beloved or destroy your beloved. And so I think that's part of why. So I've been very committed to telling that story and kind of bringing people to the conscious awareness that we're conditioning our young kids to not want to reach out. Like in the American Indian culture, you have the elder women council is like revered and respected, and the young men know to reach out to the elder women in the community and get their wisdom, but not in our culture. The elder woman is not considered wise, and we've been conditioned out of it, and that conditioning has to be brought to light. So I'm happy to share that with you, and I'll send you the link to what I did with Bob and Noel, and you can take a look at it and see if it adds any value or not. But thank you so much. I really appreciated you coming on.
I just want to jump in here, Christy. That was an amazing creative presentation that you did. And it really opened my eyes to the oppression of not just women, but elderly women, you know, in this patriarchal society, and the conditioning that, you know, we're bombarded with and continue. I mean, I guess I'm old curmudgeon. I'm saying, man, I don't know how I would turn out if I came onto the planet at this time, because I'm not sure I could deal with everything that's on, you know, that's happening now. But that's being an old curmudgeon there. But
So
but I
let
really
me,
did. I highly recommend that. Maybe Bob can find the link to that and put it in there.
sure. And before we go to Olivia, I wanted to roll this into maybe a question for Tahil around this very subject. Is in that list that you had about over the age of 50 and Christian, spiritual, and white and that sort of thing, are there lessons to be learned for us in what a couple of people have said, conditioning or programming over the course of time, whether in this society, this culture, or any other that you can speak to that you're experiencing in your 3 years with URI internationally? Is there something to be learned in the history of what has gotten us to a place where that's the majority of people that are in the circle? They're characterized by those bullets that you mentioned. You'll need to unmic yourself there.
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, myself being someone that has you know, grown up in South Asian culture. My parents come from India. I also grew up with the same Disney movies that Christy you were speaking of, where I do understand some of the extent to which maybe we might see that as conditioning, but you know, in the list that I mentioned, the reason why that list became very clear as something that needed to be brought up was because this doesn't have as much to do with conditioning as we're thinking it does.
Okay.
Because at the end of the day, you know, me being a millennial, me being 31 years old, and being able to share the space with you all, for me, is an opportunity to be able to re-examine that the conditioning of things like the media is not the conditioning of how we are expected to hold, you know, society in place. And I use that I'll specify what I mean by that. So to
Sure
the
on that.
extent that, like, I'm sorry.
So I'm not exactly clear what you're
Yeah,
saying.
sure. I'll explain what I mean. So we're talking about, you know, a reality where in 2023, I'm someone that is a millennial. I am with many of my millennial colleagues, and many of my colleagues who engage in, various sectors of work, are not very comfortable with engaging in interfaith work. And I asked them genuinely, well, what is the reason? And the reason simply is that when we look to faith leaders, when we look to faith spaces, and the power that they hold, the privilege that they hold, and the histories that they hold, people still have trust issues. And what's not changing about those trust issues is that our ability to lead, our ability to have power, our ability to have responsibility is gate kept by the same people that tell us we should show up. And that's a really big problem. That has nothing to do with Disney movies, with all my respect to Christy. That has everything to do with the system that is not choosing to change because the same people who are in power are telling us that we need to change, but they won't change themselves. And there's a lot of distrust and a big lack of confidence in looking at the same grandfathered, not to use that term in the typical sense, but grandfathering the same people who are still in power to tell us that we need to do things differently to only then get the baton is not how young people function nowadays. And they're leaving the space to go find it for themselves.
That's interesting because Bob, remember that one talk that we listened to as a TED talk, and it was about talk to your children and ask them how they explain what the issues are and ask them how they think you should vote.
Yeah. Yeah. I think
And
Olivia.
it was kind of like,
yep.
It was, it was really like, because, they're the ones going to have to live with the decisions we're making.
Right.
Yeah.
And so now to have, their voice, it needs to be in that, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe children should vote. Maybe if you're over 50, you shouldn't vote anymore.
There was a
Just
movie a
kidding.
long time ago that kind of related to that, but it included death of a certain age. But so as a result of that, Tahil, have you seen youth-led interfaith activity happening, whether it's formal within a existing organization or something new?
No, I have not. And the main reason for that is because what we now see as modern social justice movements that are led by young people, that's where the most interfaith cooperation is happening among young people. They just don't call it that.
So they aren't calling it Sunrise Movement isn't asking people young people at the door, what church do you go to? Or what's your philosophy? What's your quote religion? What's your faith path?
Yeah, they're focusing on shared concerns and shared opportunities, not shared values, because the shared values are a given.
Right, but they do, but that kind of an organization, you can talk about the details using that one example of Sunrise Movement or any other, but they do hold signs that say peace and justice and harmony.
Right.
So, thank you. Olivia, please jump into conversation.
Tahil, thank you for putting so beautifully and with such articulation what's been running around in my runaway monkey mind. I've been very aware of my background. I taught high school, I taught college, I taught graduate school, and I'm a somatic educator and an embodied leadership coach. I'm also a psychologist. And what I feel is that what you're asking us to do is to look at our own conditioning, which I have been really doing because I feel the same way you do. And I want to reach the youth. I want to listen to them. And I also, I'm curious because you said that they come together over concerns and shared concerns and opportunities. But you said something very interesting about, but the shared values are given. And if you don't mind going into that a little bit more, And I'll tell
Mhm.
you why, if I may, just a little bit more.
Sure.
Two things. I have the honor of being on the council of a Cherokee Peace Village in Lincoln, Vermont. And we are holding our 39th Native American elders, but our first elders and youth gathering this year, end of July. And we also have now started having a youth peace fest 2 weeks before. And what we found was we started it last year. And what we found was drawing people was having things like permaculture and gray toilets and how to grow your home garden and everything, as well as music and live bands and dancing and art, a lot of local art in Vermont. And I'm interested when you say that the shared values are given. Could you go into that?
Yeah, absolutely. We tend to have a really fascinating scope of how interfaith cooperation, functions as an anchor for communities. And the interesting thing that I always have noted is that many interfaith communities think that interfaith cooperation or interfaith dialogue is the end goal of why they are gathering. And I
Gotcha.
feel that that is very problematic because it actually stunts the growth of a community to think that just because you are engaging in diverse conversation and building relationships, that you have done the ultimate goal of what is needed to be an accomplished citizen of the world, to be someone that engages with everyone else. But what I'm arguing in that conversation is interfaith cooperation is not supposed to be one of the steps in a process. It's the lens at which you do everything. Everything that you do is interfaith cooperation. And if you start that as the way that you approach everything that you do, even the least interfaith looking thing is the most interfaith thing, actually. You will then you will then realize that the goal is not interfaith cooperation. The goal is actually equity and justice.
Right.
So when I say that the ideas of shared values are a given, it's with the idea that you are already coexisting, co-thriving with communities of people that already share values with you. And the end goal is not to just build a new relationship with them. It's to actually work with them to solve the bigger problems out there.
Right. No,
So
I
the
totally agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
And that's not to say that, we cannot assume that everyone knows the differences of how Muslims, Jews, Christians, and atheists see the world, because in certain ways they don't necessarily agree on every value. What we are saying is somehow there are a lot of there are a lot of varied journeys on how you come to the same value. And what we're saying is learn about the journey so that you can walk together with the same values.
Right. Yeah. And also, I think what you're saying, which is what I'm putting myself in situations where I can listen, because I know that I need to learn, and also where I can act. How can I best act to reach the most people, and also help people wake up to their own gifts? The fact many people don't realize that what they have can be used for these situations.
Right.
So I had the honor of being with my granddaughter, who's in a GAP program in a foreign country, and just sitting back and watching how she's now telling a business how to, before she even goes to college, she's telling a diverse business how to better meet their goals. And so I totally agree with you about how do we engage in conversation and know and be invited to the places where the youth are doing these amazing things.
Mhm.
And so that we can join with them, but also listen and learn. And do you have ideas about that? Like, you know, could you show up sometimes somewhere and you're the grown-up, you know, or whatever? I mean, how do you, I'm pretty good at, I can disguise myself when I need to as a high school teacher and a graduate school and everything. I've had to play many roles, you know. But what I was saying, I'd really love to hear from you more about how you would suggest that that group, of which I am in that group,
Mhm.
how we might better join in with those groups. Thank you.
Yeah, of course, Olivia. Thank you for that. The further questions. I think what first comes to mind, I think to the point that we made earlier about listening, is extending some much needed invitations to people who you are choosing to actually listen to and learn from. Understanding that they may have not been intentionally invited in a way before to actually hear about their needs and concerns. That's usually a pretty good place to start because, believe it or not, a lot of folks who are interested in the work, a lot of folks who are curious about the work, are just one invitation away from being a part of the work. Um, and we have young people that are engaged. We have young people that are already doing the good work without being in an interfaith space. We're not asking them to come in so that we can mark off the check mark that we have young people in the space. What we are trying to figure out is what are the gaps that need to be filled so that they know that there's an affirming community of people across religious and spiritual traditions that is affirming their work and supporting it. Rather than just making them be the ones that do all the work so that we can just give them the due credit. Um, because we're not just talking about sustaining a community just by replacing them with young people. We are talking about making sure that there is this intergenerational connection that says wisdom travels. Wisdom is not owned by a single group. Let's share that wisdom and actually try to commit to fixing things together. So that's one thing. The second thing is, again, this is calling out the gatekeeping that often occurs in many faith spaces. Let's step away and like open the floodgates for young people to come in. And what I mean by that is let them have their power. Give them the resources that they need to do their work. Give them the autonomy to do the work without having to feel like they have to meet your standards of what that work looks like. Give them the opportunity to engage in ways that they haven't been able to engage before, and give them proper responsibilities that actually let them feel like they're making a difference. I have seen so many interfaith communities and religious communities, quite frankly, who feel like they're empowering young people by just giving them a phone to do social media, a computer to do newsletters, or are trying to give them the space to do the physical labor so they get thanked as being volunteers for the day of a big fundraiser. That's not empowering young people. That is making them into physical capital. And that's not how they're going to feel empowered. You empower them by making sure you're entrusting them now with leadership that people still keep gatekeeping from them over time, so then they can actually feel like people trust them enough for them to excel. And it's going to take a lot of momentum, and it's going to take a lot of patience too, because I understand for many people, running organizations or communities for decades is not an easy thing to pass the baton for. But it's going to be just as disappointing when you do not have the sustainable leadership to carry it forward because you decided not to trust young people when they had the energy for it.
Yeah. Wow. Very, very powerful, very helpful. You know, as you were talking, I'm also thinking of even our social justice committee at our local Unitarian Universalist church that Noel and I are very involved in. A year and a half ago, we had 7 members on the committee as we came out of COVID, and the average age, I'm guessing, was high 50s. And today we have 17 people on our social justice committee. and almost all of them except one couple, one of which was on earlier for your presentation, all of them except Mike and Betty are under the age of 40. And so the opportunity is there for those of us that were there before to implement some of the things that you're suggesting, because, you know, and not just saying, oh, finally, we got somebody to convert all of our data from Dropbox over to a Google, or somebody that can do a Google Calendar for all the activities of the different whatever. And we've done some of that, right? Well, and going, yay, finally somebody that will do that. But empowering them into leadership is, and then let it be. Let it be.
Well, I think that's what we did, because we
Yeah.
we made them head of their own focus groups.
We
So
let them
they're-
define what their interest area was, and then said, okay, who's going to be the lead in that, call it a subcommittee, but a focus group. And it's, you know, people that are in their late 20s that are in charge of the LGBTQ and are organizing to be tabling at the last Tennessee drag show at the university tomorrow night, because it'll be illegal in this state the next day on April 1st. So
crazy.
I really hear what you're, that's very, very helpful. Have there been, within the structure of URI, have there been examples that you've seen of either university-based or youth-based new starts or taking over or whatever that are good that we can learn more from?
Yeah, actually, we have about 5 or 6 universities that are member chapters of URI, where the young people there are absolutely like they're really on board with getting to do interfaith stuff, and they do it well. What ends up happening, unfortunately, is that it only is experienced during the time of their academic tenure. The minute that they achieve the degree, there is no pipeline for them to connect to a local interfaith community to continue the work or to be entrusted with leadership, because all of the interfaith communities are like, well, we're doing our own thing anyway. Why do we need this young person? And it not turning to them to be like, oh my gosh, you are a current generation of leadership that we are looking for, and we want to empower you. And that just does not happen. And we have hundreds of institutions, over 500 of them in the United States, that have interfaith programs, that have interfaith initiatives on their campuses. Yet there's such a disconnect between the local interfaith councils and communities with those academic institutions. There is no pipeline.
Wow. Interesting. Again, that applies to us personally and directly. We have 14,000 students at the East Tennessee State University here locally, and they all have their, you know, Presbyterian ministry and their Baptist ministry, and they all got their, you know, half a dozen have their own houses, and there's a whole bunch, and we know that they do some things together. Right. We've offered to do some Pachamama Alliance, you know, workshops that would be
Environmental.
You know, that would allow them to articulate what is theirs to do, not prescriptively telling them what to do. And so again, these are great tools. And you know, Olivia's taking her usual book and a half of notes as well. Well, other questions or comments?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah, sure, Christy.
Are you aware of a social justice book that is kind of like a guide or how to get started for communities? Because I'm involved with one community. They just asked me to help organize their social justice program for them. So one of the
a couple of different books come to mind, Christy, that I'll work with. I'll email Noel and Bob within the next day or two with that list. I'm just not thinking of it at the moment, because I know there are some really good books and guides out there that would help with this conversation in local context, that I just need to like rack my brain together and remember what the name of the books.
Okay, great. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm just gonna
When we get those, we'll put them in the comments of the when we archive this evening. It links over to YouTube is where it's resident. Perfect. And we'll put that in the comment sections there, as well as on the Facebook page, the CCC Facebook page. Noel, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say some successful things I think in the past have been like, well, it's still going on. There's the Hip Hop Congress. that has been trying to get a lot of kids involved by
Congress?
hip hop.
Oh, the Hip
Hip-hop.
Hop Caucus. Oh.
Yeah, the Hip Hop Caucus. And then there was a time where they had Rock the Boat, and it seemed like they're going after a much younger demographic. But hip hop is still going on, I know, because they email me, so they must think I'm a little younger than. But and also when they talk about youth, they say, well, then you have to have an app. You have to have an app. So does URI have an app?
Well, I would actually push back. I don't think we need more apps. Young people are not going to have the patience to put on another app to do another thing that's not going to work. Just work with what they have right now, which is also not even TikTok, because that's a place to learn. It's a place to be able to grasp information, but it's not a place to activate or mobilize. So you have to think about like the purpose of trying to engage young people where they're at. You don't just create a TikTok for an interfaith council because that's where all the young people are, because they're not going to watch. That's just something we have to own. But what you have to do is invite them to examine what is in their capacity, what can they do, and what they can start doing about it. And that's where Rock the Vote and other organizations actually did a really good job, and which is why millennials and Gen Z are now becoming the larger voting bloc. In the last couple of elections, it's become very clear that they're showing up because they care about the issues. They don't care about being pandered to, or that they feel like they need to be met where they're at. They're having their voices being heard because that's the direct way to get them involved. You're saying you're supposed to be involved in the democratic process, do your thing, and they're doing their thing.
Okay, I just want to thank you for that. Victoria says, I asked my 22-year-old daughter where young people go, and she actually brought up Reddit.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't been on Reddit, but yeah.
There are a number of different apps where millennials and Gen Z go, and that's how they are able to find information. That's how they're able to fact check information. That's how they're able to do a lot of things that move at the speed of a young person, basically. And that's all to say that those are also the spaces that can incubate as much progress as it does damage. And that's where we
Yes.
also need to be careful too, because in the grand scheme of things, we are in a reality where misinformation and disinformation know how to seep through, particularly among older generations, as they've noted through research. But at the very least, acknowledging that there has to be an intergenerational approach about that kind of accountability too. If information is being shared, if it's being used as like context for legislation, if it's being used as a defense for an argument, how are you making sure that you're holding each other accountable to say that the information is actually accurate, not just because you found it on social media, but because it is actually connected to real information?
One thing about we're involved with the local URI. It's very small and it's
Right.
very old.
Mhm.
But I don't, I've got a lot of we just did a lot of stuff about creating a nuclear-free world, and you
Mhm.
have the anti-nuclear prayer and other things. But I
Sure.
don't know if there's guidance that says, this is something that you could do or try or has been successful elsewhere. Am I just
Right.
missing something?
Yeah, I think particularly in the case of, nuclear non-proliferation, I mean, the issue has not hit mainstream conversations like anything else, because everything that we unfortunately refer to are usually, related to the tests that happened or the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and are really made into these like vague, arbitrary or like abstract conversations. They're not made into, real ways of being able to hold like people in power accountable for the nuclear toilets that they were supposed to create, rather than creating spaces for, very significant environmental damage. There still is this sort of trigger happy nature of trying to use nuclear weapons as a part of war that people don't pay attention to. And a lot of that actually has to do less with the strategies of how we reach out to people in power. It has more to do with the sustainability of the outreach, because I think what we've lost sight of in the process of trying to hold elected officials accountable for the work that they're doing is we have very short campaigns for everything. We want everything to be short and sweet to make sure that they get the attention, they get the message, and then nothing changes. We see that happen with nuclear power and disarmament. We see that happen with gun violence. We see that happen with LGBTQ people. We see that with homelessness. Since the problems are so abstract and grandiose, we don't know how to sustain the conversations enough that we're actually changing the dial on how the opinion is in the general public, let alone among elected officials. And if we don't learn to actually sustain the movements for longer, even if the movements are small and we're slowly trying to get them bigger, the more you get on their case about it, the more they're going to change their opinion. And we tend to not be able to do that well, because the minute a movement goes beyond a week, we go quiet. In a lot of cases.
We're all so busy.
Yeah, exactly.
That's
right.
That's part of that distractions, I should say.
Yeah.
Busy with distractions, busy being or accepting distractions.
Yeah, and I mean, we have to sustain ourselves before we are able to advocate for anything, right? So
Right.
it's less a distraction, it's more of a trap. You're saying that we cannot exist outside of the paradigm of just sustaining ourselves so that we can hold them accountable, and that's just not a way to holster democracy.
No, I think they plan on that, but yeah, I'm very concerned about it. We had a very successful anti-nuclear gathering here this past week with experts from all across the country, very well attended. But I don't know how it's going to, as you say, sustain.
Yeah.
Media wouldn't give us any coverage.
Right.
Most of the people in the room met your criteria. There are a few young people that were involved with putting it on, and
Right.
one was the MC, and the others were the videographers, and very concerned. But the sustainability is.
Well, that I think is very telling what you just said about the media wouldn't cover it. And this is where we have come to a place where we have corporate media, and so they're going to pick and choose what will support what their agenda is, not what the average person needs for sustainability or for a life well lived. So I think that's the clue of why things like Reddit and other, and even this show here is we're making our own media platforms. We're making our own way to get messages out. We're opening the portals to have Tahil come and have the deeper conversation, which, by the way, you did an excellent job. You really got me thinking about a lot of things. And I would love for you to see my clip too, because I don't think it's just a one-off.
I'm going to send it to him.
It's a both and.
Make sure he gets it.
It's a both and.
It's
kind of a thing, because like when my mother was born, women didn't have the right to vote.
Right.
And so we've had our own suppression issues as women, and being an elder woman in our society now, I'm me, and the women who are in my circle of friends of my age, we're not looking at the nursing home as the option of what we want to do with our lives. We want to burn the boat and kick ass and try to wake people up, wake everybody up, and do what we can with our energy to bring forth a deeper and more profound feeling of connection and truth telling, and So, these values that you speak of is something that's near and dear to my heart. It's like, yeah. And so anyway, thank you.
Yeah, and the biggest, the big takeaway for me is from the conversation is interfaith cooperation is the goal, not. And because I mean, I kind of think of it that way, is that interfaith cooperation is the goal. And I really appreciate you saying, no, actually, it's the lens through which we should be looking at
That's
equity
very
and justice,
significant.
learn from other people, listen and learn from other people, and then finding where we can walk on the same path together towards that equity and the justice. I don't want to say despite our faith or non-faith or whatever, but bringing that which we hold dear in our faith, if we're that committed to something, convicted to something, bring those pieces of it into that journey together towards that destination. It's not just about cooperation. That's really the strong take home for me. Victoria, go ahead, and then we'll wrap up. See if Don wants to share anything, and we'll wrap up and call it an evening. Go ahead, Victoria.
So hi, Tahil. Thanks for all of your sharing. At first, I thought that this was going to be all about what's great about interfaith connections and all that. And instead, you brought, this is the thing, but this isn't working and that's not working. And I would like this to be different. And how can we, are we really doing what we're saying? So I find that refreshing, first of all, because I've made a commitment for myself and to Bob and Noel that I'm going to show up here every Thursday. And when I was looking at that, I'm like, I don't know, maybe not. Because when I think of interfaith, I think of, like the religious zealots, the ones, maybe not quite that. That might be too strong of a language. But I think of people that are like really Christian or really Muslim or really Jewish, like really, really holding on to their perspectives and their soapbox, trying to come together and connect and communicate. So I may have but whatever, appropriate or not appropriate, I mean, that's some of what I bring to my perspective when I read the word interfaith. And I'm like, yeah, I don't want to play in that sandbox, but I came anyway. And so I think in a way, I'm supporting everything that you brought up as, well, this is what we could be doing, but are we? So I just have to say, refreshing to have the question marks and not just the hoo-ah, and there, I forget what now, but there was a couple things you rephrased in a way that's like, now that finally makes sense. And I wish I had taken notes, but I just took it here this time. So when I remember, what was it that you said that really made sense? And it was the best way I'd heard it phrased. It was early on. I'll let you know.
Well, you'll get it from the replay, Victoria.
Yes. Yes,
That's
exactly.
the beauty of these recordings. Even though I take notes, Bob, I also listen to the recordings. Thank you.
Yeah.
You're
So,
welcome. And
thank
you,
you.
Victoria. Don, did you want to share anything at all? Welcome to unmute and speak the voice across the entire world from Tokyo. There you are.
Okay, now, well, first of all, Tahil, thank you very much for your presentation. Sitting here listening to it, I sort of felt that this was a tsunami of new information for me. And it was really an eye-opener. And also for all the other members during this question and answer period. I have learned so much. So thank you, Tahil. Thank you, everybody else. And Bob and Noel.
You're welcome, Don. We're looking forward to being with you next week. That's going to be
Absolutely.
fantastic to share your gift to the shift. Well, I have one final question for you, Tahil, and that would be, what gives you hope? In going from audacity to courage, what gives you hope?
What's giving me a lot of hope is the challenges to the status quo that I've been noticing. I'm happy to say that I'm not the only person that's sort of bringing this sort of reformist narrative into interfaith spaces. I think a lot of other folks, my age, older, younger, across the spectrum of difference, are really saying that we got to do it right if we're going to really do it intentionally. And that's been giving me a lot of hope because, again, I certainly don't want the burden of the world on my shoulders, and I don't want the responsibility of fixing the world only on my shoulders. So it's nice to have a space where people realize the role they can play in this, and they can do a better job to make a more representative, transformative movement. And getting to see that in a lot of ways, and getting to see folks like you all being willing to listen to this conversation and really thinking about the ways that you can change the way you do things versus how your president community, I think, gives me hope.
Wow, thank you so much. Really, really appreciate that. And I have to celebrate also for a moment. I believed, check me on this, Noel, we probably have 250 conversations on our archives of our Co-Creators Convergence website, including broadcasts from the World Unity Week for 3 years in a row. And you might be tied for first place as the youngest conversationalist of all those 250. I'm thinking of Courtney Bowman, and I can't think of anyone else that is in their early 30s that have been. So thank you for that gift. That gift, very, very important to us, all that will listen to this and to the world. Really, really significant. And Noel and I look forward to breaking bread with you in Chicago in middle of August. We'll sit down on the floor with the Sikhs if they furnish all the lunches for us like they did in Toronto, and break bread together, and that'll be delightful. Noel, any closing thought?
No, I just want to thank everyone for coming, and it's been a beautiful evening. I love these Thursdays. Sometimes, Victoria, I can commiserate. I go like, oh my God, we got an hour and a half, and then I get on the call, and then I get so hot, I can't get to sleep.
And we can't get to sleep for a couple of hours. So,
So I just
thank you.
love these conversations. So thank you everyone for coming, and Tahil, you're just a gift. And thank you for bringing your gift and sharing it with all of us. Loved, you just exude positivity and wisdom, and must be an old soul. You're just,
Yeah.
he's just
Right.
got it.
Well, one thing that I'd like to say as a parting message,
Yes.
I've heard that comment before of being an old soul, but I do want to remind everyone in the room that our most important prophets and messiahs and teachers were actually recognized for their wisdom at a young age. So I'm happy to be a young soul.
There you go. There you go. I like that. I like that
I'm
reframe.
listening.
That is great reframe. Thank
Very
you so
good.
much. Well, blessings to everyone for a peaceful evening. May peace prevail on earth, and we look forward to seeing you next Thursday. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Bob and Noel, for
You
both
bet.
of you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you all for coming.